So, my area of interest and kind of expertise for this afternoon's presentation is really about communication in crisis or communication during disasters. Now, disasters that's a pretty broad definition. Disasters can be very short-term, like a tornado that hits very quickly and is over very quickly, and you're almost immediately into recovery, right? As opposed to something we just went through, which is the disaster that just won't end. So these are different but very similar types of communications challenges. So I'll talk a little bit about both and the difference between those. But I think it's really important to remember that we communicate after a crisis or immediately before a crisis for really one reason: to keep people from dying and from getting ill. That's our big issue. We're not communicating with houses because we're concerned about their roofs. We're not communicating with dams because we're concerned with water overflowing them. And it's about the human component of this. And that's really important when we're talking about communication. Crises in public health happen all the time. There's vaping that is currently a public health crisis. The Flint water crisis, I'm sure you're all very familiar with in this room. There's gun violence. It's been a public health crisis for years and growing. The opioid crisis, which we almost kind of forgot about over the last 18 months, but it still exists. We also have mental health crisis, which is a problem not only nationally, but particularly here in Nebraska, where we have many, many shortage areas, and it's a problem. We have AIDS, which is still not over, still not cured, and still ongoing in most parts of the world. We have the obesity crisis. We have crisis upon crisis upon crisis all the time. And what happens with this? We have noise. We have lots of noise in terms of communication. Lots of people talking about, this is important, no, this is more important, this is equally important. How do we separate all that out? We also have disasters that are happening all the time. This is the wildland fire in Australia. That didn't work very well. These are the top kind of disasters from the last year. This is the Philippines volcano, which happened in January and killed 39 people. Did anybody else not remember that even happened? Yep, absolutely. Here's the Philippines typhoon, which happened in November. Again, in the Philippines, 42 dead. Again, did anybody remember that happened? Wow, somebody sucks at PowerPoint. So we're just going to move on. When it's that bad, just skip it. It's fine. Nobody cares. So we want to remember there are really 4 ways people process information during a crisis. Okay, there are 4 things we need to remember. People simplify messages under stress, especially short-term acute stress. We simplify messages. We do not do complicated. During COVID, we did this a lot. Here's why you should wear a mask. Here's the difference between droplet spread and airborne spread. Way too much for people. There's a magic line there somewhere where it's too simple versus too complicated, and that's difficult to find. But we need to remember that people simplify messages under stress, so we need to keep messages simple. We hold on to current beliefs. Whatever we do, it's a bad time to try to get somebody to change their belief. And when I talk about beliefs, I'm talking about things like, my home is safe. I've been requested by my state or my city or my municipality because of the hurricane, I should leave because there's a hurricane a-coming. Well, my belief is that my home is safe. It's been safe for the last 20 years. Better example here in Nebraska, because none of you have done this, heard the tornado warning and gone outside to look at this funnel cloud. Yeah, you liars. Anyway, we all do it. We've all done it. But the reason is, our belief is, I've never been hit by a tornado. I've lived here my whole life. I've seen them off in the distance. It's never directly impacted me. That's a very different conversation with one of the people we work with whose house was demolished by a tornado. She has a very different belief in terms of her risk. So, we hold on to current beliefs. So messages need to come from a reliable source. And you don't become reliable after the event. That is pre-work. You have to do that ahead of time. So, reliable sources. We look for additional information and opinions. So use consistent messages. One of the things, I don't know if you remember, You probably do. Many of you in this room remember September 11th. Some, I'm sure, were pretty young during that. But after September 11th, if you were like me, you were channel surfing. You were looking at all kinds of television stations, almost sequential, just flipping through channels like your dad had the remote, right? We're just going from channel to channel looking for new information. We look for additional information, so we want consistent messaging. My classic example of this is boiling water. If you have a tornado in your community and you're asked to boil your water, how do you boil water? How do you boil water? Put it over heat. How long? 20 minutes. Is it simmering or rolling? Soft roll. What does a soft roll mean? I know, Dick's up there like, oh, I can fry an egg. You are my kind of guy. I'm with you. So we want consistent message, and this happened. This actually happened. We had boil water orders in small towns, and you would go to one site, and it would tell you this is how you boil water. It's a simmer for 10 minutes. That's all you need to do. Another site would say it's a rolling boil for 20 minutes, which is a different thing, which uses more fuel if you've got fuel. So inconsistent messaging creates not only confusion, but reduces credibility. If you guys can't decide how to boil water, why would I evacuate my house? Okay? So that's important. We need consistent messages. We believe the first message we get. Every message after that has to overcome that first message. So we believe that first message. If the first message we got, and we did, about a year and 3 months ago, was don't wear N95 masks. Don't wear them. The reason was because we were trying to save them for healthcare workers. People forgot that part of the message because of this simplifying messages. They didn't hear the second part. All they heard was don't wear them. So now we have to overcome that because we believe the first message. So you need to be as accurate as possible when you can. I loved Dr. Coulter's comment this morning. Science is hard. We're trying to do this with scientific principles that we almost will guarantee are going to change. So this becomes very difficult. Messaging in a crisis is very difficult to do, which is why you don't let rookies do it. Decisions a leader will have to make. How am I doing for time? Oh, God, I am cooking. All right. We need to decide what we're going to release. What information is important? More is not necessarily better, right? We don't have to tell people everything, nor do we want to tell people everything. They don't care. Keep the message simple. So we need to decide what to release. We need to decide when to release it. What's a good time? For those of you that are old like me, we used to have this paradigm that we had to have everything out by 4 p.m. Why? 6 o'clock news. Do you remember those days when we had to send everything out by, it was 4:30, something like, depending on the station, of course. But it had to be out by a certain time because of the media. That's not the case anymore. However, you still need to decide when to release it. There are entire chapters of books, and I've seen them, written about when should you send out your email. When's the best time that people are actually going to read it? Short answer, there isn't one. But how to release it? What is the medium you're going to use? Is it Twitter? Is it Facebook? And the big thing to think about there is not only when you're thinking about your medium, it's the next one is, the one after that. It's whom to release it to. Who's it going to? What are they using? Doesn't matter what I use Facebook. Do you know what my kids say about Facebook? They're not on Facebook. They could care less about Facebook. You ever seen TikTok? Have you done TikTok yet? Seen TikTok yet? Yeah, that's a fascinating subgenre in and of itself, isn't it? But that's what they're looking at. And my daughter, about a couple of months through, of course, I ruined her. She's looking at the pandemic through the health and disaster management viewpoint, which is unfortunate. But she's looking at that saying, I've seen nothing on TikTok from any official source. I see stuff from like doctors that are just putting stuff up there because they want to get good information out there. But CDC hasn't released anything. Asper hasn't released anything. And they were right at that point. They hadn't because they're TikTok averse. Okay? Despite the fact that that's the audience he wanted to hit. So, anyway, I'm going to run out of time. So, 6 concepts that the Center for Disease Control talks about when you're talking about crisis and emergency risk communication. 6 things you want to remember. If you walk away with nothing else from my 20 minutes of fascinating conversation, 3 things. Be first, be right, be credible. Be first, be right, be credible. Be first, be right, be credible. That's what you need to remember from this presentation. Be first, be right, be credible. And we talked about why that is a little bit. But the other thing we want to be is empathetic. We want to promote action. And we want to be respectful. And these things are difficult to see when they're done well, but they're blatantly obvious when they're done poorly. You will recognize this. So here's the example. On April 17, 2018, Flight 1300 took off from LaGuardia Airport, New York, but ended up having to make an emergency landing in Philadelphia after an engine exploded and ripped open the fuselage, killing 1 person. Okay, get that in your head if you're on a plane. That happened. Other passengers were able to record the experience on their cell phones. Yay, bringing raw fear of being in trouble in the air to those on the ground. So even if you were on the ground and weren't lucky enough to experience it in the air, you could watch it unfold over and over again. And people did. So here's what happened. This is the response from the airline. CEO Gary Kelly made a heartfelt but concise statement to the passengers. This went to credibility. This was not the media mouthpiece. This was not the attorney for the airline. Nothing against attorneys. Okay. But, see, there's always a but. I'm sorry. You want the person in front of you to not have the tendency to be that kind of risk averse. Okay, they need to say things. The worst thing you want to do, the whole no comment thing, nobody's done that for 10 years. Why? Because it automatically makes you look guilty. No matter what comes, whatever the question is, if you say no comment, oh, they're guilty. Moving on. So CEO Gary Kelly made a heartfelt but concise statement to the family and passengers. He did it within 2 days. It's kind of slow. 2 days is kind of slow. Okay? He was first, but nobody else cared. So it's not like there was somebody that was going to beat him, but that was pretty slow. Passengers who stayed in Philadelphia were reminded with notes slipped under their doors, very personal, that support was available 24/7. All passengers received personal phone calls and emails and support and counseling resources. So they expressed empathy and they showed respect. One of the things we tend to do after crisis, we tend to do things like, come on down and talk to our counselors when you want. Nobody's gonna do that. That's not empathetic. That's the opposite, whatever the opposite of that is. You don't make people come to you. You go to them. You drop a handwritten note under their door. You bring resources to them. Don't make them come to resources. So he expressed empathy and he showed respect. He was also giving them $5,000 each with no strings. They could spend that on whatever they want to help them get back home, to help them get clothes that they lost in the airline, to get whatever they needed over the next few days. So he was able to promote action. And again, suck it, promote. Southwest and social media team kept extra tabs online for real-time information to find out exactly what people are saying, posting, and expressing. Be right. This is such a critical thing that we actually have in our audience. Dr. Sharon Medcalf runs a group of students that actually do some social media monitoring after disasters. This is a critical thing now. This is new since social media really started, but it's really important, really important. So the response, be first, be right, be credible. Action, empathy, respect. Failures, mixed messages, boiling water. How do you boil? Don't give mixed messages on something that's that simple. Mixed messages are bad. Information released late. After 9/11, responders were told to wear gas masks, like 2 days after they'd been working. Too late. Literally, too late. Paternalistic attitudes. Don't worry, we got this. It's okay. We know what we're doing. You just sit your pretty head down, Dick, and we'll take care of this for you, right? No. Paternalistic attitudes, horrible. Not countering myths and rumors in real time. Again, another reason we need that social media monitoring. That happens so much. So Jesse knows who I am. If I'm gonna not have a filter, I'm gonna get in trouble someday. He knows it could very well happen at one of his events. You can't idiot-proof everything, okay? You can't. You have to counter myths and rumors in real time. Any chimpanzee with a cell phone can tweet. They don't have to know what they're talking about. All they have to do is put it out there. Yeah, it has to be countered if it's wrong. Public power struggles. There was actually a tornado when they were, on two opposite ends of town. The mayor was on one end of town, the governor was on the other end of town, both giving a press conference at the same time. If that doesn't show you these people are not talking at all, nothing will. Okay? So you really have to be careful about power struggles and confusion. I will say that after September 11th, one of the most impressive things I noticed was Giuliani in front of his podium. He had all the right people behind him. He did a nice job of calming people without being condescending. He really handled that media on that few days very well. I was astounded, but it was very well done. Okay, communication, structure, and command. So one of the things you can do as an emergency preparedness professional, or even as a business continuity person, if you're looking at areas in your organization or your business that you think you're going to have to deal with in the future, for instance, you're going to have to deal with flooding at some point, right? One of the things you can do is put together message maps. A message map is a pre-filled message guideline that you will use during a disaster. And here's the example. For one thing, remember, this is not written in stone. These are not quotes that someone is supposed to give to the media when they stand up in front of them. These are guidelines. Is that from Pirates of the Caribbean? It's less rules than guidelines. The level of the website is identified. They're going to have a small, so if there's a violent protest, right? Not only a violent protest, but they said we're not going to address this unless it becomes violent. If this is a peaceful protest out in front of a building, we're not going to address it, but if it becomes violent, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a small box in the case of a serious injury or death, and our initial messages are, we've received reports of protest on campuses become violent. Avoid this area. One of our principles, promote action, give people something to do. In this case, give something not to do. Don't go here. You can still come to campus, but don't go down this street. Details. To come as soon as we can. Our first concern is safety. Okay? They're out here early, they're first. They're right, they're identifying the exact area where this is happening, and they're gaining credibility and showing empathy by talking about safety. Okay? University security and city police are investigating the incident. Another action that's being taken by the university. And then they actually have the next message, which does not say 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 6 hours later. It's just the next message whenever it fits. And then a final message. This is called message mapping. And this gives you a framework while you are calm and able to think through the scenario with your CEO, your public information officer, your HR team, with all the right people in the room. You're able to have this conversation about what should we talk about when and to what extent. Nowhere on here is there a no comment or anything to that extent. And I really don't have time for Wooden Barbie, but it's an awesome video. If you want to get on YouTube and watch a great example of what not to do, one of the things we used to be told was have 3 things you want to say. And no matter what the question is, you answer with one of those 3 things. Doesn't matter what the question is. Did anybody else have media training like that? That's what you're supposed to do, right? Don't do that. That makes you look like an idiot. This will prove it. Okay, Wooden Barbie. Google Wooden Barbie sometime for YouTube. And I'm out of time. Great.
Awesome. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. What I'm going to talk about is a little more general than what we just heard, but I do think it dovetails quite nicely, given that it really speaks a little more to preventative policy. A lot of environmental policy, really by design, is there to avoid these disasters and take measures so they don't end up in public health crises. So communication, as we just saw, is critical in crisis situations, but is just as critical when trying to navigate and trying to promote action in terms of environmental policy in general. Now, given the importance of environmental policies and avoiding crises, it is somewhat surprising that we don't have more effective policies in place. And this comes down to a number of factors that really determine or characteristics of environmental problems per se. And those really govern how we should talk about environmental problems and why it's so difficult, potentially more difficult than other policy issue areas. So first off, environmental problems are significantly slower moving than some other issue areas. For instance, when we talk about loss of species, it is difficult to, as an individual, to notice the drop in or the decline in insects, for instance, across each year. But if you look across generations, you see a marked change. Now the problem, if we don't recognize it ourselves, we don't actually see the problem and are less prone to actually move forward and be in favor of environmental policy or action in this regard. And that's what we call a shifting baseline syndrome. Furthermore, environmental problems tend to have really distant impacts that are amorphous, meaning, giving a climate change example, and that's my background, we know that a lot of climate impacts, even though they're becoming much more frequent right now, they are going to hit us much harder in 10, 20, 30 years' time. In addition to that, we can't entirely pinpoint what the effects are going to be. We know that we're going to have significant dramatic weather pattern changes, but we cannot say for certain how much of a temperature increase we're going to see. We've got a range there, and we can't determine that for each community specifically. So what that means is that we focus, cognitively speaking, we really focus on our present concerns. We all need to feed ourselves, find shelter, and so forth, to the detriment of future problems that are going to come up and are really going to impact us just as much as our present problems impact us, but in future. And especially when these are really uncertain, we can find some solace and essentially suggest that it's, given that there's so much uncertainty, things could really turn out a whole lot better than we believe. Third, environmental problems can be extremely impactful and significant. They can change whole landscapes, and with it, the way we lead our lives and lifestyles. Thinking about drought in Western states right now, in California, the mega drought is essentially going to determine what types of industries are feasible in the coming years, decades, which means that individuals are not going to be able to continue their learned professions. Industries are going to move sectors, and we're going to see a dramatic shift in industry, but also what comes with it in terms of individuals having grown up and really valuing their lifestyles. And this type of change is extremely threatening. And these kinds of threatening scenarios really gets met with, cognitively speaking, individuals pushing it off and trying to reason their way out of it. And this is motivated reasoning, so essentially we're just trying to find some kind of reasons to suggest actually it's not going to be as bad. And then finally, environmental problems have become extremely politicized. Now, this isn't surprising. Currently, a lot of dialogue and discourse is extremely politicized and has become increasingly more vicious. But the problem with the environment is it didn't used to be that way. In the 1970s, when essentially the EPA was founded and landmark policies such as the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, that still governs all our regulation right now, those were passed by wide bipartisan majorities. So it was really not an issue that was seen as intensely liberal, and it was really acted on by across the aisle. And just to give you a sense of how diverse or how it's polarized now in terms of how we view the environment. This is a look at, individuals were asked, how do you rate the environment? Excellent, good, fair, bad. And here the red line is Republicans, and 64% of Republicans think the environment is good or excellent. Meanwhile, liberals or Democrats, 22% think that the environment is good or excellent. So we've got a threefold difference here. And this particular difference carries forward in pretty much any environmental areas. This table here just demonstrates these numbers for specifically water pollution. But what this essentially means is that not only do we differ in terms of what types of policies we actually prefer or support, but we even differ just on political ideology and partisan lines, whether we even perceive there to be a problem in the first place. So aside from that, this ideology or this divide also governs what type of messaging or communication is necessary, even not to persuade, but even just to open communication lines. The problem with this partisan divide and polarization is that communication across the line, across the divide, has become so vicious that rather than having meaningful discussion of the actual problem and policies that might be effective, it just comes down to immediately and viscerally disregarding the message from the other side just because it comes from the other side. So in this kind of scenario, how do we actually go about putting forward a message that opens lines of discourse, opens lines of discussion, rather than persuade, just getting people to the table and communicating at the same level? So what I'm going to do here is highlight a few strategies that are often used frequently, might not be as effective, and provide alternatives that might serve better. First off, we don't always think about who is actually conveying a message. And given polarization, this is really, really critical. Given that individuals do not listen to or immediately have a gut reaction to someone who does not share their cultural or ideological background, the message content is almost lost. So that means if you don't watch who is actually conveying this message, that might severely limit what type of message you can, or the content that is even being considered. A good example of this is Al Gore communicating on the climate change, on the climate crisis. Not very effective across the aisle. So much more effective here is thinking carefully and finding environmental brokers or allies that have similar ideological and cultural backgrounds. So if communicating about environmental problems in rural Midwest, it's important not to send someone from East Coast liberal elite to do the messaging, but find someone who has a similar upbringing, has a similar profession or trusted profession such as pastor or clergyman. So that will actually lessen the pressure of this sort of visceral response and will open up both sides to actually listen to the content of the message. Second, while this seems counterintuitive, but relying on logic and reasoning to bring across a message and suggest that clearly we have this all laid out and this is why action is necessary isn't often effective. We process messages much more emotionally than we do with reason, and especially if it comes from across the aisle, we don't actually, we're not amenable to listening to the logic and agreeing with it. So what is actually more effective strategy here is connecting this with values, bringing it back to the emotional level. So if a community clearly values a lifestyle or clearly values the coming generation, linking that up with the environmental problem and suggesting this is how this environmental problem is going to impact that, and action can actually improve the setup or the situation based on your values. Third, oftentimes when individuals, and this definitely goes back to climate change examples, oftentimes when individuals don't seem to be understanding the necessity for action, we double down with data, and we just provide more evidence and more sort of indication graphics to demonstrate, again, with climate change, how significant temperature increases are going to be. But this entirely disregards that potentially the person you're speaking with does not trust the process that has actually created this data in the first place. So more data is not going to improve the situation if you disregard or discount the data in the first place. So in these particular situations, what's actually more important is to demonstrate that there is consistency or consensus regarding the problem per se. So rather than just providing more graphics or more scientific reports, demonstrating that there's a broad coalition of organizations, ideally ideologically diverse, that is in agreement regarding this particular science or the impact of an environmental problem. And just by really focusing on the consensus, it lessens the concern about the process for an individual organization or the scientific process. It really sort of demonstrates this is a broadly held belief or broadly held or acknowledged set of facts. All right, so the fourth point I want to mention here in terms of communication, and that happens a lot in terms of environmental problems, is catastrophizing the problem. It happens a lot with climate change that the impacts are going to be severe, but then the messaging or the communication is really emphasizing these negative impacts and really hitting home how damaging this is going to be. And it becomes really scary. Now, the problem with that is, first, it can be easily dismissed as hyperbole. So it never really convinces anyone who isn't on that side already. In addition to that, even if it does actually convince anyone that this is, there's a need for pressing action in terms of policy, it increases stress levels, and that is never a good idea for actual movement. It really results in paralysis. Even with the best intentioned paralysis is still paralysis. So much more effective here is a positive message and really focusing on the benefits rather than the costs and the impacts. So the opportunities that arise by taking action in this regard. So moving away from the damage, from the cost, towards the positive, that usually is much more, induces action much more. Now, having discussed communication a little bit, I want to take a step back and talk about policy design and how that links up to communication. We often think about communication and policy as two distinct parts when they really interact significantly. We tend to think about it in terms of we have this perfect policy to curb pollution levels, and now we just need to convince people that this is the right way to go about it. But in fact, if we start thinking about policy and communication as a joint concept, where we really use policy design carefully to account for these ideological differences and to really critically account for the cultural factors, we can create policy that is first more likely to be implemented. Just because if you actually are speaking to this cultural divide, you are going to have much more buy-in. Second, given that, if you have much more buy-in, you're going to have much greater compliance rates. And even if this policy isn't the ideal one on paper, if you have greater compliance and it's more likely that it gets implemented and adopted, you're also going to have much more effective intervention. And that finally then makes communication and talking about environmental problems, if the solution is much more palatable, much easier. So thinking not as these as two distinct things, but really taking them in combination is critical in adequately addressing environmental problems. And I just want to finish up by talking a little bit about a couple of, or 4 factors to consider in feasible policy design. This is not a comprehensive list. Obviously, policy design, as we all know, is extremely complicated and is has to be very much tailored to the situation. But this just gives you a sense of how the ideological divide or the cultural divide can be integrated in policy design. So first off, thinking, even just taking the first step back, whether you're going with carrots or sticks. And carrots essentially providing some kind of monetary subsidy or benefits to potentially voluntary programs, or sticks where you have punitive actions or measures in case of noncompliance. And generally speaking, while carrots are not always possible in budgetary situations, absolutely granted, carrots are unsurprisingly going to sit a whole lot better with communities, states, and so forth. But more so than that, thinking carefully about positive rewards for actions or policy really allows you to focus on the benefits of an action. As we talked previously, or a couple of slides ago, it really allows you to sort of home in on benefits. For instance, for climate change policy, there are numerous policies out there, but one that has played extremely well is increasing research and development funds, which allows the US to take leadership role in the renewable energy transition, which then creates more jobs, increases income, and provides a lot of opportunities for the US. So really just thinking about this just in a very broad way allows you to focus in on the benefits, which always are going to be more, better received than costs. Moving on, or just keeping on costs and benefits, aside from which ones you're actually using in your policy design, what's important here is how clearly they're defined. And here is where uncertainty can actually work for or against you. And in terms of, and again, I'm giving a lot of climate change examples here, but a very prominent climate change policy is carbon pricing, essentially putting a tax on each ton of CO2 emitted. This, on the books, is an excellent policy. It actually turns out it's really cost-effective and a very effective way to reduce CO2 emissions while really limiting how much the economy as a whole is going to have to pay for it. The problem with it hasn't found any leverage, given that the costs are really carefully defined. If you know that you're going to be spending this amount of, you're going to be taxed this amount per ton emitted, you can easily calculate how much that's going to increase gasoline prices, how much that's going to increase energy costs. While the benefits of this, given that this is climate change, they're far into the future, and it's difficult to connect this particular policy with specific benefits, which means you're really emphasizing the cost and say, we're asking you to do this much, pay this much, for something that's kind of uncertain and just a little possibly good, but possibly not. And even though policy analyses demonstrate that this is actually a great policy, there is a very visceral response that as soon as you focus on the costs, you're not going to get much buy-in. Third point I want to make here, and this is particularly relevant for more local and regional policy, is integrating of stakeholders. And it's demonstrated over and over again, if individuals who are going to be regulated are integrated into the process of designing policy, you are going to have much more, it's not going to necessarily be a less stringent policy or less effective, but you're actually going to have more receptance. You're going to have individuals who have reasoned through this with you. You are going to find more acceptance, and because of that, higher compliance rates, even if it's a regulatory measure. Am I totally out of time? Okay. And second, for this point, it's extremely important. Any policy is always going to have winners and losers, and being really mindful of these losers or someone who is going to be disproportionately hit by a policy is critical. You cannot wish that away. You have to address it head on and try and avert this particular impact, try and lessen the impact, and again, that's going to definitely change how a policy is received. Now I'm almost out of time. Okay. And then final point I want to talk about in terms of policy design is the actual implementation cost. And that is something, especially in terms of policymakers, sometimes ignore regarding how difficult it is to actually follow through on a policy and how costly that is going to be for the community and what kind of impact that is going to have in terms of oversight and how monitored a community or an industry feels. In environmental policy, to reduce pollution levels, there are so many different designs you can go with, but one of these is essentially a technology standard which requires industry or companies to invest in certain machinery or technology, and then basically just checks whether they have this technology in place. That is much, much easier than continuously checking whether emission standards have been kept. And that means it's a lower cost, and in addition to that, it really takes, it has less of this hands-on approach, which generally is something that is favored. So just to summarize, it's important to keep in mind that not just the environmental characteristics are meaningful in communicating, but also the political divide, and we really have to speak to that, not to persuade or manipulate, but just to bring everyone to the table and actually have a meaningful discussion about the content, rather than just a visceral reaction to someone being from the other side of the ideological divide. Second, well, given this, it makes sense to really focus more on the positive examples, using trusted in-group members to relay the message, and sort of backing off the catastrophizing. And then finally, and this is probably the main point, just not thinking of policy design and communication as two separate entities, but really integrating them to actually not just have more effective communication, but having more effective policy design in the first place. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has one, they can come forward to one of the microphones.
No, I agree. I think Fauci did a really nice job. I think he had a very difficult job, and which goes back to the question I raised this morning about kind of science education. And he was constantly kind of behind the 8 ball trying to explain subtleties of science to people that don't understand subtleties of science. I mean, that we don't do a great job of that in the US. So I think for what he had to work with, I think he did a great job. I think he simplified things as much as he could. I think sometimes he tried to explain things to audiences like us that got it, but a lot of people didn't. And again, back to that principle of, keep it simple. The more he tried to do that, I think the less effective he became. So a lot of his stuff was very effective, but as soon as he tried to really explain stuff in depth, he got into trouble. Yeah.
So very often environmental problems occur over a very long period of time. How do we do a better job of indicating that what we do now can have an impact on something that has occurred over several decades?
So that is one of the critical areas why environmental problems persist, and it's so difficult to address them. Really, as I mentioned, just emphasizing the positive aspects of this and the benefits, possibly with positive examples of other communities who have worked to prevent certain flooding mitigation or pollution problems, and seeing how that has actually averted certain impacts is an effective measure. But there is no one way to do it. And there is also no foolproof way to do it. Otherwise, we would all have prevented all sorts of environmental problems that we clearly haven't. But as I mentioned, emphasizing the benefits of action is much more effective than trying to focus on the negative aspects.
So I'll just ask this question, Kit. I don't know if you read the book from Bill Gates, How to Avoid Disaster. I found myself buying that book, and after reading it, I was just like, who is Bill Gates even to be talking to me about disaster and climate change? So, but my question is, sometimes, how do we really choose the people that should communicate about climate change and all these issues that we are having in the society? If even Bill Gates can write a book on climate change.
I think Ursula addressed that.
I think Bill Gates can speak to certain people, and he certainly can't speak to other people. I think we're probably all aware that there are some concerns about Bill Gates and his role in the current COVID crisis, and his role in the response. And essentially, these people who have those beliefs are not going to listen to Bill Gates when it comes to climate change. So specifically, we choose people by whom we connect most and who we trust most. And those are going to be the people who we respect. So Bill Gates, from that perspective, given that he's done really well for himself, gets a lot of respect. But given his liberal viewpoints and liberal agenda in terms of what types of policies should be put forward, he can really only speak to about half the folks here in the US. In terms of looking at, specifically, as you said, climate change, who can speak to more conservative groups, that is definitely going to be, and we see a lot more of this from individuals, from pastors and so forth, trusted members of the community, but also there is movement in terms of Republican representatives who are then able to speak to these kinds of crises.
I agree, and I think it goes, to Ursula's point on her PowerPoint, was that there's not a single one. There's not a person that's going to be able to present that message. It's multiple people that need to be able to present a message. My TikTok example, my daughter does not go to CDC website. If you can slap something onto TikTok to sneak in between her dancing videos, she'll pay attention to that, but not necessarily other stuff. And I'm not that way. So it's going to be more than one person. It's going to be depending upon the message and the audience.
We have time for one more question if anybody else has one.
Be first, be right, be credible. Be first, be right, be credible.